It's hard to find a good and stable job sometimes. My relationship with my superiors is constantly failing. After a couple of years, having suffered enough, I decided to find something without annoying bosses and, in general, any society of people. I looked at the ads and found something. Caretaker in the reserve. Work is not difficult, it is highly paid, and all the benefits are available, well, just like people. Having arrived at the final stop by bus, I walked a few kilometers along the beaten path and looked at the signs. In black letters on a white background, it was written about the need to comply with all the rules of behavior in the protected area. Well, these rules prevented the whole family from frying shashlikas or scattering cigarettes, and nobody cared. I walked along the path further, passing by lonely benches. It was a warm July day. Grasshoppers were chirping, and the water of the local spring was gurgling. Such weather makes me want to live more, I thought. Walking with my boots on the gravel, I found a one-story house with a high roof, gray walls with cracked plaster, and a red roof. I came closer and wondered why there were bars on the windows. Although maybe there are dangerous animals here, who knows? A sign that said Chief Caretaker caught my eye. I knocked on the door, stretched a little, and breathed in the fragrant forest air, slightly intoxicating with its freshness. Footsteps sounded behind the door. The door was opened by a gray-haired and bearded man with a camouflage jacket over a plaid red and black shirt. On his head were an army cap and similarly styled pants. A tanned, wrinkled face with blue eyes looked at me carefully. The man was not tall, but had a serious look, showing military training. "What do you want?" the grandfather asked. "I saw your vacancy on the internet and would like to get a job with you." "I see. Did you serve? Or maybe you graduated from the military department." "No, I'm a civilian. Then it's going to be harder for you." I had a questioning look on my face. What would I have to do? "Keep an eye on the preserve, the woods, and the lake. Put out fires and keep the drunken crowd from throwing cigarettes. I'll show you the hut. There are some supplies in there. You'll figure it out as the play goes on. By the way, my name is Dmitri. My name is Alexei. When do we leave? Right now, just give me a couple seconds to grab my tools." The door closed, footsteps were heard going inside the room, and after a while, the door opened again. The man was carrying a small backpack, some kind of carbine, and for some reason, a large silver cross that hung around his neck. The man's appearance was harsh, so I did not dare to ask, and followed him along the forest paths, deep into the forest. We walked, passing tree massifs, small rivers, and overgrown hills. Deciding to take a break, we stopped near a fallen oak tree and sat down on it. I dug into my pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. I offered them to Dmitri, but he refused, citing his health. I stood up, walked a few meters away, and lit a cigarette. Before my eyes was a beautiful landscape, a small forest, a couple of springs, and century-old poplars. However, my eyes fell on something dark. I took 2 steps forward and looked. In the distance stood a burnt-out hut. It was shriveled with broken windows and no door. It looked at me like a black face with its mouth open. A chill ran through me. Dmitri came up from the side, and without waiting for my question, he said, "I wouldn't advise you to look there. There's nothing to study there." Once, while one of ours was resting there, a piece of burning coal fell out of the blower and burned everything. I caught a glimpse of sorrow in the old ranger's gaze, finished my cigarette, and we moved on. A couple of kilometers ahead, we saw the hut where I was supposed to spend the night. We went in, and inside were a stove, a wooden table, a couple of stools, a pile of firewood, and a small box of supplies. On the wall hung a rifle, quite old but profusely oiled with gun oil. In the cellar were pickle jars of various kinds. In a drawer, in addition to the supplies, Dmitri pulled out a box of 12 caliber cartridges. "This is for you, just in case. There are a lot of dangerous animals here. You can't shoot just like that, only if someone attacks." He said this, looking at me carefully. I nodded, looking at the firearm. We took out a couple cans of food, ate, and then the ranger moved a stool closer to the table. His face had changed, becoming sullen, his eyebrows furrowed, and his eyes wary. And now, listen carefully. Do not go out of the house at night, especially if you hear any strange sounds, giggling, or laughter. Do not go out under any circumstances. At night, move this table to the door. Don't open the windows and don't look through them if you want to live. His voice turned into a shout, and he looked at me with glistening eyes that looked as if tears would flow from them. I looked into his eyes and could not understand what frightened me the most, what he was saying, or with what expression and intonation. The old man stopped, wiped his eyes, put the cross on the table, and whispered, "God save him, and he sees everything." He looked at me one last time, closed the door, and walked away with a quick step. I sat in the same place. My heart was pounding noticeably fast. I looked at the gun and at the clock. The time was 8 o'clock in the evening. Since Dmitri had asked so much, I wouldn't go out at night. I'd stay here, but now that it wasn't so dark, I'd smoke a little to calm my nerves. I heated the stove with some wood and left the house. When I left the house, the sweet, fresh night air hit me. I began to breathe and calm down. I took out a cigarette and clenched it with my teeth, bringing the light of the match to my mouth. White smoke started coming out of the cigarette. I looked at the bright, refreshing moon, at the stars, and at the trees. I finished the cigarette, knocked it into the ground with my boot, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a small shadow somewhere between the trees, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I closed the door, setting the table against it. A couple minutes later, I heard something that sounded like laughter, like hyenas, but more human. Goosebumps went up and down my body. I peered through the small crack in the door, but there was no one there. The laughter began to be accompanied by nervous giggling. The sounds intensified, and I heard stomping. I looked at the time. It was 10 o'clock at night. I sat down by the stove. The wood was burning and the light was fading. Something was rustling near the hut, sniffing at the place where I was standing. I sat quietly, pressed the cross to my chest, and kept silent. Something came to the door. The bolted door sagged slightly, as if someone strong was pushing it. This went on for a few minutes, but it felt like an hour. The door stopped sagging. There was a loud bang, and the door was knocked on several times. I went to the gun, I stood up, and the moment I wanted to take it off the nail, I was deafened by a loud bass voice. "Open, open, open!" A second later, I heard another voice laughing, and a few seconds later, I could clearly distinguish the voices of the 6 creatures. Laughter, giggles, and words are all mixed into a symphony of madness. In the midst of these sounds, I heard something else. Another knock, but not on the door, but as if someone was pounding on the glass with something sharp. I slowly turned my head, gripping my gun. I looked out the window and was stunned with horror. I wanted to scream, but fear gripped me so tightly that I only let out a faint, worthless wheeze. In the window, illuminated only by the faint light of the stove and the rays of the moon, was the head of a wolf with human yellow teeth. It opened its mouth. The eyes were also human, but in them there was only a malicious grin. Human dirt fell on the black fur. I raised the gun without aiming. I squeezed the trigger, but no shot was fired. I squeezed again, but the gun jammed. I tried to reload it and fire, but it was as if the gun was bewitched. I looked out the window again. I couldn't believe my eyes. I wished it was all just a nightmare, and I woke up. There were several of these creatures standing at the window. All sounds had stopped, and they were looking at me silently. At one moment, all the creatures started to put their unnatural paws on the window. The glass cracked, and at that moment, all the creatures smiled crookedly, looking right at me. My eyes darkened, my legs felt woozy, and my heart felt as if it had stopped beating after the horror. I fell to the floor, and the last thing I saw was one of them, with huge burns to the bones on its head, climbing through the window, pulling its disfigured paw with human outgrowths onto the floorboard. My eyes went black and I passed out. When I opened my eyes, I heard birds singing and the morning light illuminating the whole hut. I thought it might have been a terrible dream, but no, the window was still broken, and on the floor was the cross that Dmitri had given me. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, looking around the hut. The overturned table, the broken stools, the scratched walls. There was another knock at the door, 3 knocks in a row. I was wary and went to the door but didn't open it. Someone outside the door shouted, "Alexei, are you alive in there?" I exhaled with relief and opened the door. In front of me stood a dumbfounded Dmitri. He examined me to see whether I was wounded. I stepped out and began to look around the hut with him. It looked as if it had survived an attack by vandals. I took the cross with me and went with him. At home, sitting at the table, I told him everything that had happened to me. He listened in silence and then said, "For a long time, this attack has been here in our forest. 200 years ago, local old-timers wrote about it. They called the forest cursed. I understand what you've been through. It looks like they wanted to mock you. It's good that you're safe here, but if you'd started wandering in the forest, they would have found you again, and God knows what they would have done. By the way, remember that hut that burned down? Well, it didn't burn down by itself. The previous caretaker periodically stayed in that hut. One night he stopped communicating, so the other caretakers started looking for him. They found his hut, and it was scratched all over, with traces of blood at the door and broken windows. We started shouting, "Is anyone alive?" And there is someone behind the door. Someone is giggling quietly, scratching the door, and then pushing, lucky that the door was locked. So we poured gasoline on the house and burned it down. We kept the window at gunpoint so that if any creature came out, it would get a shotgun blast. But no one came out. Only something giggled in the darkness, and the next day the hut was inspected, and there were no remains. I thanked Dmitri for his hospitality and went to the spare room. I laid down on the creaky bed and wanted to sleep. I remembered about the cross, found it in my pocket, and began to look at it. When I saw what was scratched on the back of the cross, I felt an animal horror. Goosebumps ran all over my body, and fear gripped me. On the back of the cross was scrawled crookedly the text, "We will come for you." Before I could get out of bed, I heard laughter and stomping outside the house. I wanted to shout something to Dmitri, but he showed me a gesture of silence, while at the same time frantically loading his carbine.